This chapter is all about materials. Materials define how your 3D objects look. In this lesson, I'm going to give you an overview of materials, and subsequent lessons will go into them in more detail. To follow along, go to Working Files, open up Photoshop Projects, and then open up materials.psd. I set up this project using two presets, a sphere and a cylinder. And I have a ground plane here that I got from a photograph from Photospin, and also got the backdrop from that same photograph. So it's actually two different postcards here adjusted in 3D space to give you the sense of a wall and a floor. You also see that things are reflective here, and you got a specular highlight there, all kinds of little characteristics that are defined by materials. Let's take a look at the set of materials. I'm going to work with the sphere mainly here. To see the materials, I need to turn on the selection tool, pressing V and clicking on it like so, and that selects the sphere so that I can move it around. If I click it again, you'll see that things change here. The sphere becomes highlighted and everything else gets kind of that dull look to it. That means you're working on a material. And you can see that over here in the 3D panel. I'll click again. The sphere is selected so you can move it around, and now the material is selected. Obviously, you can make those changes over here too. You click here or there, however you want to do it. And going back to current view, then you're working with the scene. So let's go back down here to the sphere material and take a look at its materials. There are 12 of them. There are 4 here, and then there are 6 here, and then 2 more down here. Notice that most of them have folders, which means that you can actually have a file that helps define these various kinds of materials. While 10 of the materials have folders, basically only 3 of them are ones that you're probably going to use, and that's diffuse and bump and opacity. The rest of these guys, you probably won't be using files on them, and I'm going to limit my discussion of files to those 3, diffuse, bump, and opacity. Nevertheless, let's run through these guys. Diffuse defines the color. Notice when you hover over it, you get that tooltip, diffuse color and texture. You have to be kind of careful with the word texture here. Basically, texture is any file that you apply to a material. So all these guys, if you apply a file to them, they're textures. So it is a little confusing, but the diffuse defines how something looks, and it doesn't have to be a solid color. It can be any kind of graphic or image file that you want on the sphere. Right now it's just blue, but we could put a file in there like a shot of the Earth or Mars or Jupiter or something like that. Specular defines the color of the specular highlight there. Right now you'd think the color is kind of yellowish green or something like that, but the color is actually gray. It's just that the gray light is interacting with the blue sphere. Notice that here you've got a specular highlight too, and it looks yellow. That's because the object is yellow. It's going down the line here. Illumination allows the object to be illuminated from within. Right now it's black, so it's not being illuminated from within. But if I change the color, I can make it glow. Ambient sets the overall lighting for that object. Now, every environment has its own ambient light. So this environment, for example, has this black ambient light right now, which if you increase it or decrease it, does change the intensity of the overall light. Notice that the shadows don't change because the shadows are being thrown by the infinite light, this guy up here. It's a different kind of a light. Notice also when I make these changes, all the reflections and things went away. That's because you have to render to be able to see your reflections. You work on these reflections and you want to see how these guys interact. But the moment you make any change at all, just change the camera angle, anything at all, and those lovely reflections go away. You've got to re-render. I'm going to talk about rendering in upcoming lessons. So I'm going to go back in history here to the beginning here, the open, and get our reflections back because they're stored in the Photoshop file when we open it up. Let's go back to 3D again here. Click on the sphere material. Let's go on down to these 6 here. These are ones that have sliders associated with them, so you can put in a certain amount. Shine refers to how large the specular highlight is. The smaller the number, the larger the shine. Isn't that kind of backwards, but that's how that works. 80% is the default. Reflection says how reflective is the surface. Now we turned everything off again because we did one little change. I'll go back to the beginning. There you go. If I change the reflection amount, it makes this thing more or less reflective. Let me click on the sphere again to make sure we got that active. And I slide this to the right, it'll make it more reflective like a piece of metal. But again, it's going to go away for the time being until we re-render it. Go back to the open again. Roughness is like making something brushed metal. If I go farther to the right here, it'll make it rough. Right now, you're not really seeing the true rough value. You need to render to see it, but that's what roughness does. And again, I'll go over the rendering stuff and these other characteristics a little bit later. Bump is pretty interesting. It adds a texture, and there's that confusing word again. It gives your object a feeling that there are bumps on it, like a lizard skin, something like that, or the surface of Mars. And you define bump with a file. Just increasing the value of bump here does nothing. You need to have some kind of a file that says what things should be raised and what things should go into the object. And you define those valleys and peaks with grayscale. Something is black, it pulls it in. Something is white, it pushes it out. And then gray is somewhere in between. You can use a color photograph or graphic to define a bump. Photoshop just looks at it and looks at the relative brightness values. If you do change the opacity value, you will change the overall opacity of this object. I'll drop it down like this, and you'll see that it gets kind of transparent. You also notice that there's a problem down here. When you have a ground plane that you make here, sometimes the opacity has a problem when it touches the ground plane. You can overcome that by lifting it up. But nevertheless, you see there is a little bit of an issue there. At any rate, you can drop the opacity on it just by simply changing this. And you can define opacity using a file in terms of things that are black, white, or grayscale. Black areas on a file will be transparent, white areas will be opaque, and things in between will be transparent to a certain degree. So that's opacity. Refraction works with transparent objects. Refraction bends the light coming through the object to give them a feeling of reality. With a refraction of 1, light goes straight through. With a refraction of, let's say, 1.25, 1.3, it looks like it's going through water. So that's refraction. Down here are two more things. One's called normal. Normal is another way to define how materials are applied to an object. We're not going to work with normal. It's a relatively complex subject, so we'll leave that for you to examine that one. Environment defines the area around the outside of the object. It's like a globe in which the object resides. Now, all scenes like this have their own environment. I go back over to here and click on environment. There is the environment setting for this entire scene. But you can change the environment for a single object if you want to have the object have a different environment than the scene. An environment typically is, let's say, a photograph or something like that, in which the objects reside, and then you see that photograph being reflected off the object here to give it a sense of place. You typically set the environment over here in the environment properties, but you can sort of override that by setting it for a specific object if you want to. So those are the 12 materials. I do want to point out that there are presets. I'm going to explain presets in the next lesson, but here are the presets that come with Photoshop. And these presets have all sorts of elements built in. Like if you look at this one, it has some transparency, some holes in it, and also some bumps, a bump map applied to it. This one has some texture as well, also a bump map. Certain reflectivity you can see is different from one to the next. Right there, it's more reflective, more transparent, stuff like that. So these presets have various material properties that will show up here, including some files. You'll see some files showing up here when you use these presets. So there you go. That's a quick rundown on the 12 materials that are associated with any 3D object that you work on here inside Photoshop.